and we'll let it go from there. Welcome, students. Good to see you here. I'm sure more of you will be joining. Don't forget that Duncan, our guest speaker, likes to feel like he's speaking to human beings, not names on screen. So you're welcome to turn your videos on and give a wave out to Duncan and welcome him. And I'm sure we'll get more and more joining. I don't know if this dog is going to be a good participant or not, but we'll see.
What, Ryan?
You see this one dog here that's in our meeting? I'm not sure how well of a participant this dog will be. But it looks very cute, I have to say. Duncan, I want to introduce you to another colleague in our department, Dr. Neil Detweiler. He's a physiologist and teaches a lot of our pre-health students. So Neil, meet Duncan.
Nice to meet you, Duncan.
Nice to meet you, Neil.
So Duncan, I hear Devin is working on a PhD. He's at University of Wyoming?
University of Wyoming, correct.
Yeah. I saw the Impala talk with him hosted, and unfortunately I couldn't, it didn't fit my schedule, but I have such fond memories of when he took our class.
Yeah, he went ahead to do a master's at Karachiina University, and now he's doing a PhD.
Ah, that's great. That's great. How about the others? Are you still in touch with Beryl and all the others?
Beryl is also at some stage with her master's, but none of the others is after graduating went back to other studies.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, Hannah, she's looking for PhDs. She finished her master's.
Oh, great. Hannah Kamal.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Well, sometime we should just do a Zoom meeting with all those folks and catch up a bit. That would be fun.
Yeah, what the fuck are you gonna do about it? You just missed it.
You want video? Oh wait, we need video on.
Welcome, everybody. It's excellent to see you all joining us this morning. We'll wait a few more minutes maybe to allow others to sign in. Andy Ammons, can you say hi? I'd like to introduce you to my colleague Duncan. So Andy is
Hi, Duncan.
Hi, Andy.
Andy's an entomologist and molecular biologist and does work with honeybees. And I think I saw my colleague Ruth Mishler. Ruth has got some multitasking going on there. I think she's holding one of her kids. I can't see who. Ruth teaches at our sustainable farm at Mary Lee. And she's an expert in small animal husbandry, including a specialty in goat rearing. So that's very applicable to Laikipia region.
Yes.
Eric Lamafa, hello, good to see you. Welcome.
Hi, Eric.
Good to see you, Duncan. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me. Oh.
Wonderful, good to have you here. Okay, thank you for everyone's attendance. I was looking forward to this event all semester long. The possibilities we have with COVID in terms of connecting across the globe is a small silver lining amidst the tragedies of the virus. And so I'm hoping that we can continue to experiment with this kind of international connecting and collaborating even well beyond COVID. So I will make a short introduction of Duncan. I'm hoping that you have a screen that you can put his picture up so you see Duncan.
Is it like running earbuds?
Duncan is a colleague of mine. I also consider him a very dear friend. We've known each other for more than 8 years. We first got to know each other while doing field work together in Kenya, and Duncan then finished his PhD and is now doing a postdoc and is also chairing a department. So let's go back in time. Duncan got his undergraduate degree at Moi University in Kenya. Then he went on to get a master's degree. Is that right? Did you get a master's before your PhD? Sorry, you're muted, Duncan.
Yes, you're right, at Moi University as well.
Also at Moi, okay. Then at the University of Nairobi, he got a PhD, and now he has a Smithsonian Fellowship, which is serving as a postdoc. All the while, he's the chair of the department at Karatina University, where he's a professor. And so he supervises master's students, teaches 3 classes, 3 undergraduate classes, and is doing research. And the location in which he is presenting today is a place called Impala Research Center, which is an international research center in Laikipia, Kenya, which is in the rain shadows of Mount Kenya. So Duncan is a prolific publisher. He's very busy, but one of the things I've always appreciated about him is in addition to his academic acumen and scholarship, he deeply cares about people and his students and works really well with others. And I have been motivated and inspired by that kind of individual. So Duncan, I want to thank you for being a colleague and a friend through these years. I'm going to now ask Duncan to share his screen, and while he's doing that, I want to just give a few ground rules for today. He's going to give us a presentation that will probably last about 35-40 minutes, and then we're hoping to reserve some time for questions right at the end. There is a nice buffer in that my class, EcoEvo students, will be Zooming for our class starting at 11. And so we can actually have some of those students hang around right up until 11. But a lot of you will need to drop out at 10:50, I think, and go to your other classes. So we'll hopefully have some time for Q&A right at the end. So with no further ado, Duncan, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you so much for fitting this into your busy schedule.
All right, thank you, Ryan. And it's really a pleasure to be with you tonight. Oh, it's morning at your place. Yeah, it's almost getting evening. And it's honor to have worked with Ryan on many aspects, and also Eric, who is in the meeting. And today I'll be talking about some of the work that we've done here at Impala together with Ryan and Eric and other colleagues. And my focus today would be on aspects of livestock-wildlife interactions as well as fire. It's hard to, put everything. Sorry. It's hard to acknowledge everybody who we have worked with, because really great minds, a lot of people that we have collaborated in many ways. But here is some of the faces that we keep interacting, and some of the people that have been very instrumental, not only in working together, but also in shaping my career. We've been lucky with the work that we do here through various funding sources, NSF, National Geographic, and Impala as well has been very instrumental in supporting our work and laying the logistics. I wanted to put this slide up first because I might forget to acknowledge great people that we have worked together. So one of the aspects of savannas and the system we work in is that we know that human element is way deeper here than anywhere else. We have the oldest records of human presence in this kind of system. For over 1 million years, people have coexisted in these savanna communities. It's also a system that we know has been burning longer, even before existence of humans. And really, just to say that humans did not invent fire in this system, they only learned how to control it and how to manipulate it. But the system has been burning way long. But then we realized that aspects of cattle and livestock are really new to this system. If we go back into the history, we see the movement of cattle from the Middle East and how they were originally domesticated from the Middle East and moved all the way through Northern Africa and to Eastern Africa around 400 million years ago. So then we start wondering how possible is this different natural forces, first having cattle in the landscape and also having fire in the landscape can coexist. And one of the things that comes to our mind, borrowing from the traditional pastoral practices in this system, is that pastoralism used to be conducted at low stocking densities. The key here being that there were few people living in the landscape and consequently also less livestock. But also we know that some of the natural forces like periodic droughts, sometimes warfare among communities, sometimes disease outbreaks, used to work to keep livestock populations low and at the land, at the point where the land can support them. But we know over the years, the modern society has worked so hard to eradicate some of these natural brutal processes. And consequently, we are seeing increase in livestock densities beyond point where the land can support. And this has resulted into widespread degradation in some of the areas and to some extent replacement of some of the native ungulates, the wild animals that existed in this landscape. But then the interesting bit is that there remains some remnant ecosystems like East Africa and also part of Gorogoro in Tanzania, like Laikipia ecosystems that remind us of a world where livestock and wildlife coexisted together. However, we know that the future of these systems is not secure because we have seen decrease in livestock, we've seen decrease in wild animals, or rather decrease in wild animals, and the culprit has always been implicated to increasing livestock densities. It's clear that livestock and wildlife coexistence is problematic, and if inappropriately managed, we know that it results into degradation, but then we don't know to what extent wildlife and cattle can coexist if wildlife and stocking densities for cattle is maintained at moderate level. Also, we also don't know what the role of fire and how fire can shape these interactions between livestock and wildlife. And we know that although a lot of aspects of cattle and wildlife point to existence of competition, perhaps because of diet overlap, but then we know that habitat use for cattle and wildlife differs substantially. And also, to some extent, you also get differences in diet between livestock and wildlife. And it's not clear even to what extent we can rely on this diet overlap as a measure of competition. So really we need experiments that test the role of fire and the interactions between different groups of herbivores in this system, just to begin shedding light on how they are able to coexist and how we can promote that coexistence in the landscape. The Kenya long-term exclosure experiment was started in 1995. It's been existent for 25 years. This was from work of Truman Young, a professor at UC Davis, and he came and set up these fences that are aimed at controlling different combinations of herbivores. I'll be talking about that in a bit. But just to point out here that these exclosure plots are located in one of the prominent soil communities here, the black cotton soil. It's an interesting soil type because it has very heavy clay, and it's characteristic, just like any other clay soil, it shrinks when it's dry and expands when it's wet, and that has different implications on the kind of communities we find here. Because it may interest you to know that we have only one tree species that is dominant in this landscape that forms more than 95% of all the tree species. And also grass species is less diverse than other soil communities in the region. So we have quite diverse animals, but the mostly common animals that you find here include elephants and giraffe that we categorize in our case here as mega herbivores. So when we'll be referring to mega herbivores, we'll be talking of either those two. And then we have the mesoherbivores, a large suite of mesoherbivores, zebras, hartebeests, elands, oryx, and steinbok. So a bit about the design of this experiment is that I said it's a series of fences that are designed to keep away different combinations of herbivores. We have these fences on the right that sort of maybe may not be very clear on your screen, but there are a series of fence lines that are electrified. And the idea is that they control most of the large herbivores and keep them out of the plot. And then we also have a series of other plots that have fences that are high enough to allow medium-sized mesoherbivores to walk in through, but they keep away elephants and giraffes. Based on that, we have a series of treatments depending on which herbivore combination is allowed in these plots. We have plots that keep away or just are open to all herbivores, cattle, wildlife, and mega herbivores can come in. And then we have another set of plots that are only open to mesoherbivores and cattle. Another set that is only open to cattle. It's completely fenced out from all forms of wildlife. And then in these three treatments, we have an additional layer of treatments that do not include cattle. So in total, we're talking about 6 different combinations of herbivore treatments. Each of these treatments is replicated 3 times, allowing us to compare differences across treatments. The way to think of this experiment is that it's trying to mimic different management regimes. In this landscape, I should mention that there is diverse land uses. There are people that are tolerant for wildlife, and there are people that are tolerant or do not allow do not allow wildlife in the land. And also, depending on where you are, you could have elephants, you could have giraffes, or they may be missing. So really, this is a one-stop shop where you can walk and see all these different management regimes and how they affect the landscape and how they play out in terms of changes in the community structure. You can also push it further and think of this experiment as representing different extinction scenarios and start interrogating questions of what would happen, for example, if we didn't have elephants in the landscape, if all wild animals were gradually replaced by cattle and all that, and then you start getting to a point where you can even start thinking of such possibilities. You can also think of it as reverse extinction scenario where you are trying to reward different a community with different species of wild herbivores and cattle as well. So in 2013, with Ryan, we set up additional layer of treatments in each of these 18 herbivore treatments. We went ahead and banned small plots in each of these exclosure experiments. And again, in 2018, with Eric, we went ahead and rebanned another series of such small subplots within each of the herbivore treatments. So I'll be talking about some of the cool findings we have found regarding to livestock and wildlife interactions, but also how these interactions are shaped by fire. Here is just to show you how our banned plot look like. It's very exciting times when we are burning, and Ryan would attest to that. So some of the things that have come up from our plot perhaps may not be surprising to know that cattle do suppress broad spectrum of wild herbivores, so that in plots where you have cattle, you find less of most of the herbivore species. And this is not just restricted to species that graze, but also species that are known to be mixed feeders that browse and graze as well. Therefore, cattle are suppressing both mixed feeders as well as grazers, and not what you would expect that they are only have negative effect on grazers. But then we also found a twist to that these negative effects of cattle are only more pronounced during dry seasons, and during wet season when resources are abundant, you get less effect of cattle. Also, when you bring mega herbivores in the equation, those are elephants and giraffes. In a way, they help to reduce these negative effects of cattle on wildlife. So what does this mean to the landscape? The idea is that during wet season, there's a lot of competition, and to a property owner who has cattle in the landscape, wildlife would suffer during dry season, but then that's also tied to presence of elephants. We also are able to demonstrate that wildlife, on the other hand, have negative effect on cattle, that a cattle farmer who has cattle in the landscape sharing land with wildlife suffers more damage during the dry season. But then during the wet season, a land that is shared between wildlife and cattle tend to do better. So during the wet season, a farmer that has cattle benefits from also having wildlife in the land. So then we are talking of two opposing forces where the negative effects of wildlife in the landscape on cattle can be actually reversed during the wet season. Other aspects that we've been able to demonstrate using this sort of exclosures is that cattle and wildlife have almost similar effects on the herbaceous community. And what is important in this landscape is more about the grazing pressure rather than the species of herbivore that is grazing. Similarly for trees, all the different species of herbivores in this system have some effect, negative in that case, on tree species. And Some of the mechanisms resulting to this obviously is through browsing. They can reduce tree density through browsing, but also trampling and removal of grass cover that in some way could protect seedlings from browsers. Also, we realized that herbivores do reduce fire temperatures. By doing the burns in 2013, we found that plots that have cattle, for example, burned with less temperatures during, or rather plots that have cattle in, the fires were less severe. And that's true for every addition of herbivore, so that by grazing cattle and also wildlife, allowing wildlife in the landscape, that could help reduce the pressure, the temperatures of fires when the landscape burns. Another thing we were interested in this system is just understanding what are the effects of fire on trees. And it was interesting to realize that almost all trees in the landscape can survive fire, or a bigger proportion of trees in this landscape can survive when you burn, and they do so by either resprouting from the base if they are seedlings, but the bigger trees are less affected by fire, and you almost get 100% survival or a greater survival immediately after fire. But then we also learned that elephants love their trees toasted, particularly because elephants target trees in the burnt areas. And even though the trees can survive fire, but consequently after fire, elephants preferentially knock down trees in the areas that have been burnt. And therefore, you come back, if you come back 2 years after burning, you realize a lot of trees have already succumbed to elephant mortality. Some of the mechanisms related to this increased elephant damage after fire include impacts of fire on mutualistic ants that live on these trees. I should have pointed out that this particular tree species, Acacia drepanolobium, occurs in a symbiotic relationship with 4 species of ants, and the ants are effective in slowing down the rate at which elephants browse on the trees. But then when you burn, our work with Ryan has demonstrated that fire alone can reduce the colony densities of these symbiotic ants, and therefore trees are left vulnerable to elephant browsing. Other mechanisms related to this could also include the idea that fire stimulates trees to start resprouting, and consequently elephants may also be attracted to the fresh regrowth after burning, and therefore consequently they damage trees more in the burnt areas. What this means is that one driver, fire alone, may not have much impact in this landscape, but then when you combine fire and herbivores, you get dramatic effects on the trees. We've been able to demonstrate lots of other relationships that I won't have enough time to go through, but then this graph here shows just many of the relationships that we are being able to demonstrate using these sort of exclosure fences. But then just as I try to wind up, I want to point out here, even though we are saying cattle can coexist with wildlife in the same habitat, we are not really meaning that by saying they are compatible, we don't really intend to infer that there is no conflict. It's true, there will be aspects of conflict. There will be aspects of livestock depredation by wild carnivores. There will also be aspects of disease. But then it's the idea that we can manage the interactions between cattle and wildlife so that we can mitigate these negative effects and maximize on the benefits of having cattle and wildlife in the same landscape. But then all these are things that we are talking about in terms of past tense, because we know things are changing and it's increasingly becoming uncertain what the future holds to this landscape. Some of the trends that are emerging in this landscape relate to the pastoral communities and the pastoral livelihoods. First, obviously, human population is increasing, and that calls for increase in livestock densities, also sometimes changes in the livestock species that are grazed in this landscape. For example, we see gradual replacement of cattle with camels and goats in some of the communities around Laikipia. There's also changes in land tenure where previously land would be owned communally, but now we know that is shifting towards private ownership and land is being divided to private individuals. And the question of whether these private parcels of land would serve the same way as the communal land where there was greater mobility of cattle across the landscape, allowing changes in the grazing intensity and leaving time for the land to recover. Also, they switch from nomadic to sedentary life with increased provision of facilities and increased education facilities, increased provision of water, and also settlement around areas where there are health facilities. And this is going to change the whole pastoralism regime completely. Also, there is also access to formal education and also access to external funding sources as people who live in these communities seek opportunities elsewhere for in terms of job and reinvest money back home to support the communities, but also to buy more cattle. Emerging wildlife tourism enterprises is also going to change the landscape. Also, access to livestock markets, cultural transformations, and all these also tied to aspects of degradation. And a lot of things are changing drastically in these communities. The question is, are we going to keep talking of tourism or of pastoralism in the same way we have seen it before? And how is that going to influence wildlife and coexistence in this landscape? Finding a path that will reconcile these pastoral practices and modern societal values like biodiversity conservation and ecosystem services is going to remain a challenge in this landscape, but then we want to believe it's not a challenge that cannot be overcome. And I want to stop there and allow time for questions.
Thank you very much, Duncan. We do have time for questions. I think if we go back to our big grid screen and if folks can unmute their videos, we can have an opportunity to have a dialogue about this. I did want to point out a few guests who I noticed are with us that I didn't mention in the beginning. Duncan mentioned one of them, Eric Lamafa. Eric is somewhere here. Eric, can you say hi to everyone and tell us a little bit about where you're at, what you're up to?
Sure. Oh, sorry. I'm Dr. Eric Lamalfa. I'm an assistant professor at Utah State University, but I completed my PhD research working with Duncan. He was a little bit ahead of me, but thankfully we overlapped, and so the research that I did was kind of in collaboration with both Ryan and Duncan and Wilfred O'Dotty, who was also on that, the presentation that Duncan gave, and a couple other folks, Truman Young. But my research focused on the interaction between, well, Duncan mentioned it, kind of how saplings that have been top killed, specifically I was focused on those top killed saplings. And so, I mean, all the stuff that Duncan talked about just now, he made it a really tidy, succinct story, but it's important to recognize just that one little question is what happens to these saplings that are top killed after fire when they're exposed to different types of herbivores. That was a 6-year dissertation and lots of data. And thankfully, I got the opportunity to interact with lots of great people over there. But currently, I'm teaching faculty at Utah State. And so I teach a variety of courses in the Natural Resources College and the Wildland Resources Department. So I teach a lot of the techniques classes that have to do with forestry, range management, and wildlife management. And hopefully I'd love to do more research with these good folks that you're lucky enough to be learning from today.
Thank you, Eric. It's good to see you. Congrats on your job too. And then we have 3 former Goshen grads who were able to participate in the research from the Goshen College perspective. So I think I see Luke Zaire and Will Knegge and Leah Amstutz. So welcome to the 3 of you. It's good to have you here. Just to show you that, you know, once you graduate from Goshen, you go on to do wonderful things. So Luke finished a master's degree and is now working in the field of ecology, and Will is working in the lab doing molecular work, and Leah Amstutz is in medical school. So welcome to you guys. Now, let's pepper Duncan with some questions. What do you have for Duncan?
So earlier you mentioned it sounded like some positive interaction between mega herbivores and cattle. Could you talk about that some more?
Thanks, Alex. The effect that we're getting from mega herbivores relates to quite a number of factors. Some of the mechanisms we are still exploring, but one of the obvious one is just how mega herbivores affect grazing behavior by cattle. I should mention that in addition to browsing, mega herbivores also graze, particularly elephants, and not grazing, but they also pick stuff on the ground. Yes, they graze, they take significant amount of grass, but also they focus on forbs. So there are 2 important things on the herbaceous layer, the grass, but also the forbs that are basically leguminous plants that grow within the grass layer. And these are the spices of life, if I say, in this savanna ecosystem, because it's what most of the animals are looking for when they are grazing across the landscape. And elephants, incidentally, are also looking for them. So really what happens is that when you bring elephants, when elephants come in, they pick these forbs in addition to feeding also on the grass. And subsequently, when you bring cattle in, because we graze cattle periodically and take them out, when you bring cattle in, they spend more time moving around, looking for these forbs, and consequently, they feed on less grass. How are we able to know this? Through some experiments where Wilfred O'Daddy supplemented the diet of cattle with proteins and then grazed through the landscape. Clearly, cattle that had been given, protein before they went to graze spent less time looking for the forbs, and consequently, they spent more time, they ate more grass. But then when they don't have that initial kick of protein diet, nitrogen, they'll spend more time, looking for that diet within the grass. So indirectly, what that means is that when you bring cattle in these plots where elephants have depleted their forbs, they will feed on less grass because most of their time is spent looking for the forbs. And because their presence in the plot is very limited, they will leave behind more grass for zebras. And consequently, zebras would love that because perhaps they care less about the leguminous forbs. So that's just one of the mechanisms. The other mechanism could relate to the impact on tree densities and whether that facilitates the herbaceous layer. We know clearly trees could shade off grass, but and areas that have higher tree density consequently would have fewer things growing underneath them. And that in a way could also affect grass availability, but also productivity, consequently negatively affecting other group of herbivores. So then when you bring mega herbivores in the equation and they knock down a few trees, they open up the habitat for better grasses, and consequently that could facilitate other herbivores. The other mechanisms relate to aspects of nutrients, and Judith Sitters was able to demonstrate that elephants are also influencing nutrient dynamics, and consequently plots where they graze, they affect nutrient dynamics, and that also translates to what pastures you get in those plots, and that could also be beneficial. So it's really a lot of interconnected relationships, some of them that we have tested, others we haven't tested, but then it's work in progress.
When you were talking about low stock densities, like during the cattle slide, can you explain a little more on that?
Sorry, I didn't get your question, Tiffany, please.
Oh, like for one slide, you were talking about low stock densities for like cattle, I think it was. Like, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more on that.
Yes, low stocking density. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers on top of my head, but we are talking of moderate stocking densities, and I know this is a relative term. I wish I had the actual stocking densities, but then we're talking of moderate with respect to what happens in other areas. For example, in the communal lands where stocking density is so high to the extent that you see the actual impact in terms of bare ground. But in this system, it's moderate because you don't get grazing extent to that level where grass is grazed throughout the year and leaving bare ground. So sorry, I can't give you numbers on top of my head now. Do you have any other questions?
You had mentioned that there's kind of a move away from communal lands and more to privately held lands. I'm wondering if there is like much of a difference in land quality, like if one type as it's changing is like better cared for, or like what are you seeing as that switch is happening as far as like what's happening with the land itself?
Yeah, one of the big differences with the land tenure is that communal lands, okay, I should maybe clarify first. Communal lands is the kind of group ownership where you have a certain number of individuals communally owning land and, grazing it together. And then the other system is where such land is subdivided among those members of those communities so that each member has entitlement to a certain piece of land and can make individual decisions on what to do with that land. The two systems present different challenges and opportunities. The one where land is communally owned, obviously there is a tendency that there is little investment in terms of caring for the land and so on. But then the important part of this is that if you have communal land and it's large enough, and that allows for some level of movement. And if there is some organization about how grazing is done, then you end up with a system where you don't graze one area for way too long to degrade it. When it switches to private ownership, the opposite could happen where there's less mobility in terms of livestock, there is intense grazing and consequently degradation. But you could also see individual incentives from those private owners to manage their land better now that it's their land and it's with their property. But then the bottom line in all this is reduced livestock mobility and also diversification in the land use. For example, if you have individual parcels owned differently, there's a tendency one owner would say, okay, in my land, I'm going to try crop cultivation, or I'm going to try to fence it out. And then once you do this, you start now getting conflict among these different communities. So it's really one of the things that could either go right or it could really go terribly wrong. And there is indication as most of these communally owned lands are privatized, there is indication towards degradation or diversification in land use that could be detrimental to management of the ecosystem as a whole.
We have a few more minutes. Other questions? I have a few percolating, but I can ask Duncan later.
So do you often interact with farmers and talk to them about allowing more wildlife into their lands, or is this just research in a preserve?
Part of what we do, thanks Alex, part of what we do is to be able to provide, we do research to test things out, but be able to provide solutions to the farmers, the pastoral communities, the ranch owners and all that. And every now and then we would normally hold workshops here at the research center, invite the ranch owners, the pastoral communities and all that, and share information, insights of what we are getting with them. But then it's really goes down to the point of providing information and enough information and allowing people to make their own decisions on how to manage the land. So yes, we do a lot of outreach with the local communities, the farmers, the pastoralists, the ranch owners, and all that basically to reach out to them and tell them what are the implications of different approaches to managing their land.
And do ranch owners and pastoralists, are they generally receptive to this research, or is there some resistance?
Some would be very receptive, others would resist, just as you would expect. It goes down to individual conviction on what is right, and clearly, we have examples of where some of the recommendations that we've done have been adopted, but also we have examples where they have not been adopted, but then it's really a question of what they are convinced is right.
Is you talked about introducing fire to your research, but is fire still a part of like land management, just among like people who are owning ranches? Is it still a thing that happens? Like I know here, fire is basically not used very much at all anymore. It's just the same way?
It used to be common. It used to be used a lot. But over the years, the use of fire as a management tool has gone down. It's kind of confounded. First of all, is that in areas where there is increased grazing, or in areas where there is heavy grazing, like in the communal lands, it's almost impossible to burn because there is hardly enough grass to burn, and therefore, even if fire was to be applied, it will not really burn. So there is increased fire suppression because of continuous or intensive grazing in many parts of the system. But then we also have parts, private lands that can potentially burn, but the owners choose not to burn. And then we have systems where the ranch owners are still using fire as a management tool, and they apply it periodically to manage the landscape. But then all these are tied to availability. And one of the things that people are skeptical about burning the land is just the idea that when you burn, you clear the land, you clear all the pastures, and then with unpredictability in rainfall, that if a drought follows a period when you have burned, then that means to the ranch owner, there is no grass for their cattle. So when we have several months of several rainy seasons that where grass grows, then people become more willing to burn. But when you don't have that, they are reluctant to burn.
How about within like the wildlife preserves, where there's like larger areas? Is that still used as a management within the preserves, or is it just kind of left to chance?
In some of them, it's used. In others, it will be chance. When you have build up of enough fuel loads and there is accidental fire, it just burns everywhere. Also, in some of the government protected areas, we have areas where fire is used. We have other areas where fire is strongly discouraged. And I always have this feeling, if you don't burn it, it will still burn. Only that it will burn severely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right. Well, we are to the hour of 10:50, and so I am going to stay on with Duncan for another 10 minutes, and anyone else is welcome to do so. At 11 o'clock, I'll switch to my Zoom for my class. But let us all, in whatever way you feel appropriate, hooting and hollering by unmuting your voice, or clapping or whatever. Let's give Duncan a big round of applause. Thank you so much, Duncan. Thank you so much. I'm grateful to have him as a colleague, and I'm grateful to introduce some of you, hopefully, to him in person sometime when we continue our research together. Okay, so if you have to run off to another class, you're welcome to do so. If you want to hang around for a bit, you're also welcome to do that. I had a question for you, Duncan. In the emerging threats, and some of those were not threats, but maybe opportunities, the changes that are coming afoot, I'm wondering what you think about climate change as part of that, and how the mechanisms that we're learning from CLE might differ in that region in the context of climate change.
Obviously, climate change is affecting, and it's going to continue to affect these systems in ways that we have not seen. We are seeing more unpredictable rainfall, and we've seen the land being affected more by this unpredictability. But then also when you talk of, for example, when you talk about drought, really we need to think about drought as not just how long before the next rain, but also start thinking about severity of drought in the same way we think about fire. We need to think about drought and severity in the same way, that you could have severe drought more severe drought for equal amount of rainfall, depending on what is the condition of the land when the drought hits. So to the extent that if a land is already degraded, any drought or any mild drought will have more devastating effect. And therefore, when you have widespread degradation, effects of climate change will also be more pronounced, and I would think the communities would suffer more, even when not necessarily there's less rainfall.
Yeah, and the competitive interactions between wildlife and cattle would probably be amplified versus when we have more periodic rain. Yeah. Anybody else want to ask a question or make a comment?
Yeah,
Yes.
Duncan, I had a, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. I guess the pattern of rainfall influences the type of vegetation found in savannas. But in what ways does the cotton soil influence the growth of acacia trees? You mentioned that it's the dominant type of plant in savannas. How does the soil affect its growth?
Yes, that's a very good question. Initially, we would think, okay, there's a bit of, it kind of goes two ways. First, the soil properties, the shrink and swell, you can imagine that could affect tree roots, and therefore you'd even think of a system where, you even think of a classic example where Acacia drepanalobium is the most well adapted to deal with that shrinking and swelling of the roots, also the qualities of the soil. But then it's more complicated than that, because in some of the herbivore exclosures where we have kept away herbivores, or we have kept away elephants and other big browsers, we're beginning to see all the other most of the other tree species that would, or we would imagine if you were to just stick on the soil properties kind of explanation, they would not exist there. But then it's really a combination of herbivores that are also affecting the presence of these trees. And it's more complicated because Acacia drepanalobium does well in these black cotton systems, but then it does poorly in the neighboring sandy soils. One thing about black cotton soils is that they have more nutrients than the sandy soils. And I talked of ant mutualism and how it's important to protecting the tree against herbivores. But then it takes a lot of resources for the tree to maintain such mutualism. And when the tree grows in less nutritious soils, the sandy soils, it means there is fewer resources to maintain the mutualism. And some of the experiments that have tried, planting trees in the red soil, planting acacia drepanalobium trees in the red soil, the trees don't do well and they suffer more browsing because they cannot maintain mutualism. So then we have a system in black cotton soil where there is enough nutrients, but also for the tree to maintain nutrients to reward the mutualism, and therefore they are able to survive browsing better. The other tree species do not have that mutualism. It's only exclusive to acacia drepanalobium trees. And therefore, when they grow in black cotton soil, they suffer more browsing pressure when they are surrounded by other trees that are well defended. So really what maintains this monodominance is more complicated than just a simple question of whether the soil properties, but also how soil properties interact with the nutrients and the mutualism and the herbivores.
Thank you.
Ruth, did you want to ask your question?
Mine was a similar question about the soils, and with these heavy clay upland black soils, what is the impact that you're seeing, fire and herbivores, a combination? Are we seeing a decrease in organic matter, an increase? I was just kind of wondering what some of those interactions were.
That's a good question. The aspects of nutrient dynamics in this system, I mentioned a bit about some work that has been done by Judith Sisters, just came out recently. And the paper compares nutrient dynamics in these different herbivore treatments. And one of the issues that came out very strongly is that cattle are net exporters of nutrients from the landscape, particularly because of the management practices where they graze across the landscape, and at night they are moved to exclosures where they are protected from predators, and therefore what is happening is that they are grazing on the grass but depositing it elsewhere in form of dung, and consequently removing nutrients from the landscape. That story changes a little bit when you bring mega herbivores in the equation, because mega herbivores in a way are also breaking down trees and facilitating nutrient fluxes in the soil. So anytime they break trees, bring them down, that decomposes, incorporated in the soil, also through their dung and all that. So really, we're talking of a system where if you had cattle only, you'd end up with soils that are deprived of nutrients. But then if you have this other community of native herbivores, then they are able to offset some of the negative effects of cattle on the nutrient dynamics.
Okay.
Thank you.
With thank you all for staying around. With that, we'll have to unfortunately draw a great conversation to close. But if any of you are interested in reaching out to Duncan with a question, contact me. I'm happy to forward an email to him. But again, Duncan, we'll keep in touch. Appreciate you so much, and thanks for spending time with us today. And I see Will, a former student of yours, Kinegi and Luke Zaire and Leah Amstutz were here, so you've influenced them also. A lot of them were excited to know that you were talking, so thanks again.
Thank you, everyone, and it was great having you, and thank you.
All right. Have a good night. Sleep well, Duncan, and the rest of you, have a good day. We'll see you later.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you so much, Duncan.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, friend. Take care. I'll be in touch.
All right.
Thanks again.